Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming out on this dreary day. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm a professor of government and foreign service here at Georgetown and serve as our vice president for global engagement. And on behalf of President DeGioia and our entire university community, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's conference on global refugees and migration in the 21st century, policies and narratives of inclusion. Now, as you can see from our program, we have an excellent set of speakers lined up, including our keynoter, Denis McDonough, a Georgetown alum who also served as Chief of Staff under President Obama. It's going to be a great afternoon. Over two panels, we'll hear experts discuss with one another and with all of us how we might best grapple with one of the most pressing moral and policy challenges of our contemporary global era, the growth of refugee and migration flows, and the policies and politics of inclusion and, unfortunately, exclusion to which it has given rise. Think of the more than 5 million Syrian refugees, or of the millions of migrants who have entered the United States from Latin America over the past several decades. Just two examples of more than 60 million human beings on the move, crossing borders around the world, the largest number since World War II, driven by a diverse mix of political persecution, economic need, and other causes. Now, our focus today will be on destination countries, on the management and on the mismanagement of the inward flow of migrants and refugees. We'll be looking at policies on the local and national levels with a focus on the United States, but also on Europe and other countries, other parts of the world. We'll be looking at the role of civil society groups, including religious organizations in particular, in fostering just and enduring forms of inclusion. And we'll be discovering and exploring whether and how policy successes and failures in some or in certain geographical, social, and political contexts may hold practical lessons for others. Now, our conference today marks the launch of a university-wide global refugees and migration project, a two-year interdisciplinary exploration of these critical issues through conferences like this one, through research and teaching, and through policy consultations that bring scholars and practitioners together to develop concrete recommendations. With this project and in our aspiration here at Georgetown to be a global leader in the study of refugees and migration in the 21st century, we can build on some strong foundations, especially in our School of Foreign Service and in our Law Center. Georgetown is home to the Institute for the Study of International Migration, or ISIM, within SFS, our School of Foreign Service, a leading center for research, teaching, and outreach on this vital topic. ISIM is a co-sponsor of today's conference, along with our university-wide Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, a leader in the study of how religious forces intersect with global challenges, including migration and refugees. And you'll be hearing from Catherine Donato and Sean Casey, the directors of ISIM and the Berkley Center, over the course of the afternoon. Before turning things over to Catherine, who will chair the first panel, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the members of our Georgetown community who have made this conference and our wider project possible. The Georgetown University Board of Regents is made up of remarkable women and men supportive of our ambition to advance solutions to the world's most pressing problems through research, education, and service. The Global Engagement Committee of the Board of Regents, under the leadership of Roger Orff and Eddie Zwaiter, has generously supported this gathering and the Global Refugees and Migration Project as a whole. We're very grateful. As a Catholic and Jesuit university, the oldest in the United States, a country of migrants, Georgetown seeks to advance understanding of a complex issue, to promote creative policy solutions, and to serve the national and the global common good. And I'm confident that with the help of our speakers and through dialogue with all of you, we'll be able to make some progress on this important agenda today. So thank you all for being here, for joining us for this conversation. I'm now going to turn things over to Catherine Donato, the director of ISOM, who also serves as the Donald G. Hertzberg Professor of International Migration in our School of Foreign Service. So please join me in welcoming Catherine and the first panel to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction and nice summary of what we hope will be a project that lives on for quite some time and does some very important work. So today we're here with the first set of panelists. I'm Catherine Donato. I'll introduce everyone right now, and then we will just go from one person to the next. Everyone knows that they have about 15 minutes to speak, and then after that we'll do a Q&A. Our first speaker is Mike Mitchell, who is the Associate Vice President of U.S. Programs at the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS. He serves as a strategic advisor on HIAS's efforts to expand resettlement networks, to fully integrate refugees into our communities and enable these refugees to achieve greater success in their lives. After that, we have Rachel Peric, who is the Executive Director of Welcoming America. This organization, she joined the organization in 2011. Rachel works to create, and Welcoming America works to create communities where current residents, immigrants, and refugees can thrive and belong. She has assisted the growth of Welcoming America from its startup in the United States now to a global entity, which I'm sure she'll mention. Our next speaker will be Joan Rosenhauer. She is the Executive Director of the Jesuit Refugee Service, and leading the organization's, she's fairly new. We're very excited that she's the new director. She's leading the organization's efforts to accompany, serve, and advocate for refugees and displaced persons in more than 50 countries around the world. Joan has spent most of her career advocating for social justice and mobilizing the U.S. Catholic community to do the same. And then finally, we'll hear from Hans van der Weerd. He is the Vice President for the International Rescue Committee. He leads U.S. programs in aiding those who are struggling and enduring through the world's worst humanitarian crises. Hans has expertise in international business, crisis management, cross-cultural management, communications, and diplomacy. So with that, let's welcome Mike Mitchell as our first speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Last month, a man walked into a synagogue and killed 11 people. And before he went into that synagogue, he posted that he was going to go in because HIAS was bringing invaders into this country. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something along those lines. And the issue of integration, the integration of refugees in the United States, relates directly to what happened in Pittsburgh. So today what I want to do is I want to talk about 4 issues to be a little bit provocative in looking at how refugee resettlement happens in the United States and some of those issues with that resettlement process and integration process, and then some possible solutions to catalyze conversation. So the first thing is that when the Refugee Resettlement Act was passed in 1980, there's this fantastic system that came about which basically allows different community-based organizations to work through 9 national agencies, of which HIAS is one, to resettle refugees for the initial resettlement process, which lasts about 90 days. Actually, the Department of State requires it's actually within 90 days. And we have a resettlement model that is for resettlement, but the problem is that it's not for integration, right? So one of the first challenges I want to bring to you is that over the past 40 years, agencies like HIAS have followed this system, and every year we resettle refugees through this system. Each passing year, there are new regulations and requirements for the local resettlement agencies. And so every year that happens, you have the local resettlement agencies that have to do more and more on requirements. So for example, it used to be that you could just do one home visit to make sure that the place that a refugee was going to come was going to be a safe, secure place. And now the requirement is 3. So whenever you put requirements like that on a local CBO, community-based organization, you end up requiring them to spend more and more money, and yet the amount of money that those local agencies get has not increased. Issue number 2 related to the Act is this. So it's a public-private partnership, but as those regulations have increased, the desire of agencies to make sure that they're in compliance has actually lessened the number of volunteers that have been able to get involved. And that is an issue. So some agencies, I'm giving you generalities, so there are exceptions to agencies that have gotten around this. But the issue with that goes back to integration is that as local community-based organizations have tried to do resettlement in a compliance manner, they've been less likely to welcome volunteers who are the people that want to welcome refugees and who are going to speak out against hate when somebody makes an accusation about the danger that a refugee brings to society. So the first thing I say is about the infrastructure of the system and a challenge that we face. The second thing is that this whole system focuses on the initial resettlement. It doesn't focus on the integration of refugees. Now, different organizations, different resettlement agencies have done a fantastic job about figuring out ways to increase the length of resettlement by focusing on integration programs. And some of these programs, actually from the federal government, will go on maybe a year. And there are individual programs that federal agencies have supported that will take it up to 5 years. But in general, the whole system is set up for initial resettlement. And this has profound impacts, and I'll just mention 2 examples. Number 1, in the United States, a refugee needs to get employment almost immediately. And we have seen people that come to the United States as engineers, as doctors, and they are driving a cab, they are in your hotel doing the housekeeping. And that is something that's got to change, because if the system doesn't support a way for them to build a career trajectory back to what they did, we're not only harming them, we're harming the United States economy, because all of this talent is not being engaged and utilized. Another example is housing. Because there is a limited amount of money that comes into the system, the local resettlement agencies are required to get housing right away. And so what they do is they have to find a landlord that's willing to resettle somebody that they haven't seen or they don't know. And a lot of this comes about because of fantastic relationships that the Catholics have, that IRC has, that HIAS has on the local level. But oftentimes what happens is you're resettling a family in a lousy housing complex that is many miles from public transportation, and this is another huge issue. So the third issue I want to share is the issue of volunteering that I touched on in the first point. Volunteers are what makes America great in many ways. And just with this tragedy in Pittsburgh, HIAS, for example, has seen tens of thousands of people reach out to our local affiliates and say they want to volunteer. Now, HIAS in the past year has actually, 2 years, has actually developed a pretty robust volunteer system where we can track names, track hours. We're doing a lot of these things. But volunteering is not simply a transaction of a volunteer helping a refugee get an apartment set up. True volunteering is the relationship that comes out between the native-born American and the refugee. And it's a two-way process that happens. And if that is not magnified, then we lose out and we allow the space for people politicians to say that refugees are a danger to society. And that's been happening. But if we could figure out how to increase the number of volunteers that are coming out to volunteer and get engaged, they then go home and talk to their friends, talk in their faith communities, and they change the perception of refugees. Lastly, I want to say that the system has been really stubborn to change, and I'm speaking about the law and the act. So many of the local community-based organizations, many of the resettlement agencies like HIAS are working to test new ideas and new ways. But see, these things are really tough to do when you're governed by an infrastructure, by a federal government that requires things to be done in a certain way. Now, some agencies are doing something about it. So I'll give you one example. One of the things that I realized when I came to the resettlement world is that in the United States, what happens is there's an allocations pool, and every Wednesday, it's like an NFL draft, and refugees are basically go through each agency, and each agency says, we will take 100, and then they go back the next day and they ask their different affiliates who can manage these. And the decisions are made on the capacity of local sites. They're not made on what's in the best interest of refugees. Now, I can tell you that they are made in the best interest of refugees, and to a certain extent, they are. There's anecdotal information that we'll take, you know, like what health options are there, what jobs are there. So one of the things that we recently did at HIAS is we built a machine learning algorithm. It's artificial intelligence, and it actually predicts where a refugee is going to be more likely to succeed based on past experience and past data. And it's not perfect, and it's a first step, but what it does is the person that does the allocations will use Annie. And by the way, we named it Annie after the first immigrant to arrive at Ellis Island. Her name was Annie Moore, and she came from Ireland. And what Annie does is it'll say, okay, this refugee could go to Ann Arbor or this refugee could go to Cleveland, but they're more likely to succeed if they go to Ann Arbor. And it's incredible. And these are the things that we as resettlement agencies should be doing. So what are the answers? So the first thing I want to say is that you will hear from humanitarians like myself that we need to get on the ball and say that this is a humanitarian issue and we need to do something about justice and social justice. But I want to throw out something to you totally different. I want to say to you that actually I think it's a question of identity, that Americans they feel, many people on the right feel threatened, their identity feels threatened. And the reason the system worked for so long is it was kind of under the radar, and because there was less transformation happening in the global economy and the US economy. But now, because there's so much with machines and losing jobs, that people feel scared. So the refugee system actually is threatening the identity of Americans. So if refugee resettlement agencies want to be successful, they have to answer this identity question. And I think it comes down to something like ancestry, because every American will love to tell you about, you know, my grandfather, my grandmother, my great-grandparents. And if refugee resettlement agencies can start to address this, we can actually make a difference with people that are in the middle of the road and doing things. So those are the main points that I'd make as you think about resettlement in the United States and integration in the first 90 days and what we need to do to change the system. We have to change the structure of the system. We have to focus on long-term integration and what we're doing about it. We have to increase the ability of Americans to volunteer and volunteer in genuine ways so that they have relationships with refugees that in turn will lead to changes in policy. And lastly, they need to allow for innovation like Annie, which I shared, and innovation that lets refugees connect to companies. I was just in Dublin at Microsoft, and there was something called a Net Hope, and it's a collection of big tech companies and large NGOs. IRC is a member, HIAS is a member. And one of the things we heard there from the folks at Microsoft is they're saying, we don't need fewer refugees, we need more refugees. Because when you are sitting at a table and you are trying to solve a business problem, that business problem is not best solved when you have 5 white guys like me sitting around the table. If you have people from around the world, from different cultures and different backgrounds, you're going to have more diverse solutions coming up to solve that problem. And that is what makes America great. And that's why refugee resettlement in this country has been such a profound positive, and why we need to rethink and think about how to move towards integration. Because then, only then, will we be able to contrast ourselves from the vision of someone like a Donald Trump that says that they are a danger to society, because refugees are what makes this country great, and immigrants are what makes this country great. So thank you.
I want to just begin by thanking Georgetown for the invitation to be here today and for putting this series of panels together. And I also deeply want to thank all of you for trudging out in this miserable weather to give your afternoon to this topic. I was asked to come and speak a little bit about the work that my organization, Welcoming America, does to create communities where everyone, including immigrants and refugees, can prosper, thrive, belong. But I actually want to begin on a personal note, because this topic of refugees is personal to me. My own family came to this country in the late 1940s as refugees. My mother and grandparents were helped, actually by HIAS, but it could have been any one of the resettlement agencies you see up here. So I wouldn't be standing here today if it were not for the good work that all of you are doing. My grandmother went on to open a small business. And that business became the backbone of my family, but it also became part of the backbone of the economy of New York City, where they lived. And in fact, today, immigrants in just the city of New York alone account for about $210 billion a year in economic activity. Now, I'd like to think that my families are superheroes, maybe they are, but it's not that immigrants or refugees are superheroes. It's that economic benefit happens for the very reason that Mike just talked about, which is that when we intentionally design our companies, our communities to be places that attract and incorporate a diversity of perspectives and ideas, they thrive. But that very pragmatic opportunity to see a community thrive economically, to live out our best humanitarian instincts around this issue, at a time of massive migration, at a time of huge demographic shifts, are running up against a challenge. And that challenge is our very natural instinct to hate change and to fear the other. So the question becomes, how do we create communities where we can move past some of those concerns to really create places that can thrive and take advantage of some of those economic benefits and become places where everyone can fully participate in? And I want to share with you now a little bit about what we've learned in that process at Welcoming America. And that story begins here. More than a decade ago in Nashville, Tennessee. And what you're looking at is a picture of a mosque that was burned to the ground, and an article from The Nation, which describes Tennessee as being both one of the biggest resettlement destinations and also the white-hot nexus of new American nativism. Now, what had happened in Nashville? Well, like a lot of other parts of the country, Tennessee went through a huge demographic shift. We are just coming out of one of the largest eras of migration that our country has seen in about a century. And unlike some past waves of immigration, people tended to settle in this last one in places like Tennessee or Arkansas, or a whole lot of other places across the US that didn't have a recent history of migration. And so what they saw was both a very fast change and a very unfamiliar change. And that's exactly what happened in Tennessee. And so some organizers were working down there to try to make life better for immigrants and refugees, and they discovered that the climate was just getting worse and worse. And they asked themselves, well, what are we not doing here? We're providing services to people, helping them learn English, access jobs. Well, what they realized they weren't doing was reaching out to the broader community. And in the absence of that others were, and the messages they were hearing weren't particularly positive or accurate ones about who their new neighbors were. So they launched an initiative that was called Welcoming Tennessee, and it was really an effort to try to change not the policies at that time in Nashville, but really the climate. And they did three basic things. First, they organized leaders from the community who cared about this value of being a welcoming place. And not just a welcoming place for new people coming into the community, but also a welcoming place for people who had lived there all their lives and also felt deeply unsettled by change. And then from that, they did two other things. First, they brought people into contact with one another. So Mike was talking about the power of volunteers to come together, build relationships. That often doesn't happen naturally in communities that are deeply segregated or where fear or language can get in the way. So over simple things like a meal, they began to build relationships across lines of difference. And they also began to work on the narrative. What were the messages that people were hearing about refugees and other immigrants coming into the community? And they began to look at how to shift that and to orient those messages around common values that people shared, working with local media, putting up billboards, helping expose people to their new neighbors and to the things they shared in common. That work ended up being successful in beginning to turn the climate around in places like Nashville and in smaller towns like Shelbyville, Tennessee. And over time, once the climate had begun to shift, then it was possible to begin to do some important policy work, and you'll hear more about that on the next panel, in terms of what the city could do to make it easier for people to transition into their new lives, to become part of the fabric of the community. Today, the city of Nashville has an Office of New Americans, and that office does things like run the My City Academy, which helps newcomers in the community get to know how government works, help people in government get to know who their new residents are, and builds a stronger civic fabric. The other thing that happened in Nashville in this period of time from about 2006 when this work began up until about 2012 was that Nashville became the largest job-creating economy in the country. Now, immigrants and refugees didn't cause that, but we went back and did some research with the Nashville Chamber of Commerce, and it is very clear if you talk to business leaders, political leaders, the community in Nashville, that they couldn't have made that intentional tack, they couldn't have realized that economic benefit if they hadn't made this intentional tack toward being a more inclusive community. So we found that over 80% of business and community leaders feel that immigrants have, for example, helped businesses reach a more global audience, and that efforts to incorporate that community led to tangible economic gains. And that makes sense at an intuitive level if you think about the fact that in places like Nashville and many other parts of the country, you're trying to attract and keep international talent if you're a business. And if people arrive and their kids are getting bullied in school and they're getting dirty looks in the street, they're not going to want to stay there, and that is bad for business. So from the work that happened in Tennessee, my organization, Welcoming America, was established to help communities all over the country wrestle with this issue, come out on the other end in a better place. And today we work all over the country. Our footprint covers about 1 in 7 Americans and 1 in 4 new Americans. And as Catherine mentioned, we've also begun doing some work globally to tie together people whose natural instinct in a community is to try to live out this value in a different way. This is a map of our membership. We're about 200 members and a little over 500 communities in the US, and you can see we're all over the country, but especially in some of the places that have become new destinations for immigrants and refugees. A few things that we've learned in the course of doing this work over the last decade. One is that one of the things that happens when a community changes demographically is that people just sort of respond and start delivering services. What doesn't happen is an intentional effort to really bring the community together to plan for that change. And so in cities like Dayton, Ohio, that kind of planning is now taking place. In the case of Dayton, in the midst of Alabama and Arizona passing some of their most restrictive policies around immigration, Dayton said, we want to go in a different direction. And they brought local residents together to create the Welcome Dayton Plan. How can we position our city as a place that everyone can feel at home in? And they now continue to do this work as a partnership between the city, nonprofit organizations, faith community, business community, local residents. And that work is both about reaching out and building a bridge in the community, but also about making sure that whether you're in a school, you feel welcome. Whether you're trying to buy a home, it's easier to do that. It's easy to open a business. Whether you're an immigrant, refugee, or anyone in the community. The result of this has been, on a very pragmatic level, that Dayton, which was a city that was losing population for about half a century, has been able to turn that around for the first time. New people are moving there, they're buying homes, they're opening up stores, and that is good for the economy and good for the city. I mentioned Arkansas as being one of the places that is new to demographic change. They have also recently developed a strategic plan focused around how to build a more inclusive community. Their business community has been very supportive of that. And really it's about identifying all the different barriers that people in the community face to being full participants, whether that's civically, socially, economically, and identifying ways to break down those barriers while also lifting up this narrative that everyone truly belongs. I like to talk about the importance of 3 ends as a 3-legged stool. And those 3 ends are narrative, neighbors, and norms. We've talked a little bit about narratives. This is an example. We've been doing some work over the last several years with the YMCA of the USA. And they have done some amazing work both within their own organization but also in communities to really lift up this idea of belonging and creating a more inclusive environment, which is important for them in their own roots in the community, but also sends a strong signal to other mainstream organizations that this is a value worth supporting. Neighbors, again, as Mike talked about, we know from a ton of research that what really changes people's perceptions around the other is the chance to encounter the other. And so by creating connections that bring people together, whether it's over a meal, a community garden, on a university campus, we can begin to shift the way that people see this issue. And lastly, norms. And for us specifically, that's about changing norms at the local level in terms of the kinds of policies that guide this work. We often think about immigration as a big, hairy federal issue. It is, but there is also a ton that local communities can do and are doing to move forward policies that help people stay safe and be full residents in their communities. And you're, again, going to hear more about this, but we've been working to help communities open offices like this new one in Dallas, Texas, a very conservative state that hasn't always been particularly friendly to immigrants, but Dallas is bucking that trend in their efforts within the city. And the last thing I'll share is that, or be the penultimate thing that I'll share, is one of the things that we're trying to do is change the incentives that are driving people's behavior on this issue. So looking at ways to lift up the places that are doing the right thing through programs like certified welcoming, where we've actually started to go in now and certified communities as welcoming places. We know there's a lot of leaders out there, more of them after this election, that want to live out these values of inclusion, but we want to make sure that they're living them out in their policies and in their practices, and this is a way to give them some recognition from that, and then also a tool that they can use to market their community for trade, tourism, and investment, and that way we further a virtuous cycle. And over time, our hope is that by working at the community level, building up this narrative, showing that it's possible to create communities that are truly inclusive and benefit as a result, we can begin to reach a tipping point in this country where that just becomes the norm. And it's in all of our interest, because our research has found that when we do that, it's not just to the benefit of refugees and immigrants, it's really to the benefit of whole communities. Communities become more economically competitive, they become more socially cohesive, the fabric that binds people together is stronger in welcoming communities, and by looking at ways to make services more inclusive for some people, we make services more inclusive for all people. I'll leave you with this quote from Richard Florida, which I love, around the imperative, which is that nations that are more accepting of and better integrating new immigrants have a higher level of economic growth. and development. So how we maximize that opportunity, how we live up to it, is the great work that others on this panel are doing every day, and that I hope you all will be a part of. And please don't hesitate to reach out, look to our website for tools and resources, and stay in touch. And I'll leave it there.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you. And again, I want to thank you for getting out in this weather. It was kind of a surprise as I'm coming down from New York on the train. All of a sudden, you get halfway here, and it's the middle of winter. But I guess New York is getting there soon. So I was asked, so I'm with Jesuit Refugee Service. I'm the executive director of JRS USA. And JRS USA, or JRS in general, is not a resettlement agency. But we do work in 52 countries, I think, right now, around the world with forcibly displaced people, refugees and others who have been forcibly displaced. And so I was asked to kind of glean some of the best practices. What can we learn from other places around the world about the best way to welcome refugees and other forcibly displaced people in the short run? So I did a little crowdsourcing. I contacted my colleagues in Europe and the Middle East and Africa, and even some of our partners in the US, including in the Catholic community. I also have had a chance to do some traveling in the last few weeks to see the work of JRS. And so drawing on all of that, I came up with a list of some possible best practices, and it's actually quite a list. There we go. You can see they had all kinds of ideas, my colleagues. I think the one thing I want to highlight, though, is that what we're experiencing here in the US is happening around the world, and that is reception and compassion fatigue. So even where there are best practices that were lifted up, in many cases they're at risk in the countries that have been practicing them because people are getting really tired of so many refugees, 68.5 million, as we know, displaced people around the world, and they're really feeling like they've been welcoming for a long time, and it's hard to keep that up. So let me just go through a few of these and explain what my colleagues suggested. The first thing that they said the US can learn from other parts of the world is scale. We all know that there are countries that are absorbing displaced people at levels that just are so completely kind of overshadow what the U.S. is doing. The 1.5 million people in Lebanon, a country of just over 4 million. We were talking last night at an event about how the U.S. is kind of panicking over, the whatever it is, 5,000 to 7,000 people who are coming from up through Mexico. And there was a time when Uganda was absorbing 5,000 people a day. So in terms of scale, the U.S. Can certainly learn some things from other countries. And the fact that they have done that, I was just in both Lebanon and Jordan, and it's quite remarkable the extent to which it's not perfect, and people are suffering in some ways, the displaced people coming to Lebanon and Jordan, but they have found a way to absorb huge numbers of people when we, as we know, are now limiting our refugee resettlement to 30,000 a year. The next thing that people mentioned was to make the case that there should be no long-term detention. And it's interesting to watch how this is developing because for example, most of Europe, they do not allow long-term detention, but in the UK, they are now supporting long-term detention as a part of their policy of creating a hostile environment for displaced people coming into and refugees coming into the UK because they want to discourage it. In the US, while there may be some court rulings that would suggest that we can't detain people for very long, there are ways around that. And one of the things that happens is that they will keep people in one detention center for a period of time and get just up to the limit of the court ruling, and then they'll release them and re-detain them in another center. And so people actually have been staying in detention in the US for quite a while. Recently, my colleagues, because we also work in detention centers trying to provide support to people who are being detained by the US government, and my colleagues in Texas have said that all of a sudden they started releasing people. Except the problem was that whereas in the past when they released people from detention, they would try to help them get transportation to their family and a plan while they were going through the asylum process, These folks were just being put out on the street with nothing. No money, no plan for transportation, no nothing. And the local communities were having to scramble to try to respond. So, no long-term detention. We know what kind of trauma that creates for both adults, but especially for children. Obviously, one of the first things you have to do when people, in the short run, when people arrive somewhere, is to make sure that their basic needs are met: housing, food, those kinds of things. And I think there's some great examples of that here in the US as well, certainly a priority around the world. I do want to lift up the Migration Refugee Service at USCCB has this POWER program, and I'll say a little bit more about it, but it's parishes organizing to welcome refugees. And they are really mobilizing to make sure that the basic needs of having access to food and a way to provide for those needs, and housing and all of those things are met. Another model that was lifted up, and in some ways it's related to what we just heard about from Welcoming America, the idea of cooperation, that the best models in different countries, and Portugal is an example of this, there is very clear, strong cooperation among the business community, the nonprofit or civil society, and government. And it sounds like Dayton is an example of that as well, but certainly one of the best practices that we would want to lift up, because that's how people have a holistic experience when they come. Their needs for a job, their needs for housing, their needs for a variety of services are more readily met. Okay, the next one. I'm hitting the wrong one, aren't I? Thank God for this thing, so I see what I'm doing here. There we go. One more. Okay. The next one is that the resettlement of people has to be localized and small scale. In Europe, they've developed this hotspot policy, which all of my colleagues in Europe oppose, because it really concentrates the short-term reception of refugees in a few key places in Italy and Greece. It was originally intended to acknowledge the reality that those countries were bearing a burden that others were not. But the problem is that now those reception centers have become the place where people stay, and as opposed to other programs that have people spread out and across communities. Germany has been doing that, although again, all of these places you're seeing compassion fatigue and things are changing. But Germany is an example of people being distributed all over in communities and with families and in a very spread out way. And that clearly, my colleagues would suggest, works much better than having these focal points, which in some ways is similar to what we do here in the United States. Another key thing that is a part of the early reception response has to be legal support. And here in the US, we are just completely falling short in terms of the needs for legal support for asylum seekers. The difference, we were just with a group from Fordham University last night who send law students down to work with people in El Paso. And what they said was 80% of the people who get law student support on a volunteer basis for 2 weeks or something like that, 80% of them end up being released and allowed to continue pursuing their asylum claim. 80% of the people who don't get that support end up being deported immediately. So you get a sense of the impact that legal support, and we are falling very short on that. Integration classes is something that really needs to start from the very beginning when people come in. It's not something that you can put off because they are going to be in a completely foreign place. And so they need to both have the kind of structure in their lives that they can go to a class and they can meet other people and they connect with people in the United States. But things like language, learning about the culture, learning basic life skills, how do you use the public transportation system. Financial literacy is a big one that we've learned about. Again, MRS does a lot of that. I'm sure the other ones do that as well. But those early integration classes are really critical, and they are certainly being used or offered around the world. Psychosocial and spiritual support also has to start from the very beginning. People come here traumatized, and they need help dealing with stress. And we see that every day in the detention centers where we work in Texas and Arizona and Florida and things. People have enormous stress levels, and just giving them a chance to express what's stressing them out, and also to learn some skills that help them to deal with their stress can make a huge difference. But I also want to highlight spiritual support. It's important from the beginning that people who are very observant in their faith have an opportunity to practice their faith and get support for that. So to have services available to them for Muslims to be able to fast during Ramadan and get support for that wherever they end up, including in the detention centers. Those kinds of things are hugely important when people first arrive so that they can feel like they have some normalcy in their life, and the important things that are sources of support are continuing in their lives. Education, sometimes that's seen as a later intervention for forcibly displaced people, but it really has to start from the very beginning. For students, this is a class in Burundi that I was at last week, and you can see the enthusiasm. One thing I will say about refugees and displaced young people, they are so enthusiastic about education. They want education. Where I was in Lebanon and met a Syrian family, and while I was there in the middle of the day, their two 12-year-old twin boys came rushing home. They'd been working like 4 or 5 hours of work in the morning, one at a barbershop, one at a bakery, and ran home, showered, and were ready to go off to school and couldn't wait to get to school. They were so committed to going to school for another 4 or 5 hours into the early evening. And I kept thinking that 12-year-olds in this country don't have that level of enthusiasm or appreciation for school, but refugees and forcibly displaced children do, and we need to meet that need immediately, and we need to assume here in the US that they can't just be dropped into a public school and thrive. So the support systems that help them to kind of adapt to the US system, that's very important. Another thing that my colleagues mentioned that is a very important best practice is to create mentors, and we've talked about that a little bit already, that can really make the difference. There may be challenges to volunteers, but that really can make the difference in people being able to adjust to a community and for the community to accept them. And again, there are a lot of this POWER program that MRS has, and there are a lot of other programs that connect people in a way that they have that support and have mentors. Germany has done a fabulous job of that too. So the final point that I want to make, and this isn't exactly a best practice for welcoming refugees and other displaced people, asylum seekers and others, but it is something that's important from the very beginning, and others have mentioned it, which is the need to communicate the stories of refugees and displaced people and advocate on their behalf. That has to start from the very beginning in local communities to tell their story, because they are often quite remarkable people. It's something I say all the time. The refugees that I meet, or forcibly displaced people that I meet, have been through traumas that I can't imagine and are adapting to situations and struggling in ways that I can't imagine, and yet they are kind and welcoming and compassionate, and they build new communities, and they're survivors. And I often think they're much stronger people than I would be in those situations, and we need to get their story out. They are impressive people who deserve to have their stories told, and it's something we need to do always and everywhere to communicate and advocate. Thank you.
So thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to Georgetown, but not for putting me at the end of a formidable panel. That's a little difficult, but I'm prepared. I have nice visuals that have maybe little to do with what I'm going to talk about, but if you get bored, if I start to duplicate things, at least you have something inspiring to look at. To be clear, I'm not an academic. I'm not a professor. I'm an aid worker. I work for the International Rescue Committee, and we work across the globe along the arc of crisis. We work in places like Yemen, Syria, El Salvador, Greece. We have offices in Berlin and Boise. And the common thread of our presence all over the world is that we work with people that are displaced because of war, conflict, or violence. And some of my colleagues said this, what we are inspired by is the immense resilience of the people that we work with. And, you know, we consider it a real honor to be able to work along people and to really help, you know, basically their efforts to thrive in their new community. Now, for today's discussion, I was asked a little bit to provide the global experience of IRC. And I will talk about successful admission and integration practices at some point as well. I think, you know, talking about the global environment, and I, you know, have to go to the next slide. This is our network, by the way. Talking about the global environment, I think it's an understatement to say that today's environment is harsh for refugees and migrants. I think that under President Trump, the United States is leading a race to the bottom when it comes to refugee and asylum protection. And that the logic for that assault is really based on fake arguments around security, around integration failure, or, you know, around the economic costs of program. And, you know, just reacting a little bit already to what one of the earlier panelists said, I think we have to be a little careful also not to sort of like go along in that crisis language, right? I mean, if you talk about refugees, they're 0.3% of, you know, the world's population. You know, 30,000 refugees, 100,000 refugees, you know, have nothing to do with, you know, the capacity or the ability of this country to work. So we have to be careful, you know, when we talk about numbers that we don't adopt, you know, the crisis or the alarmist language. This administration has really framed refugees and migrants as a domestic issue. As an issue of insiders, us, you know, versus outsiders, them, that we need to be afraid of. But the really troubling, you know, thing is that it doesn't only impact our domestic politics. It has huge foreign, you know, policy implications. To give you one example, largely due to the American withdrawal, the shortfall of global resettlement places was 94%. There is about 1.3 million people in need of immediate resettlement. At the moment, we are barely able to provide resettlement to 90,000 people, you know, across the world. You know, and that even concerns people like the Department of Defense, because they have to deal with America's allies that start to worry about, well, what's going on with refugee policies. At the moment, there is about 100,000 Iraqis that actually helped, you know, our government in Iraq, waiting to be resettled in the United States. But a promise, you know, that so far, you know, is not being kept by this country. It's not only the US that has become more restrictive, you know, and although I think it's slightly different in tone and rhetoric, Europe too has, you know, gone to much more restrictive policies, and its populist members like, you know, Hungary, that are really driving, you know, the EU to sort of like outsourcing their border management to places like Turkey and Libya. Europe's resettlement framework, you know, despite, you know, decades of work, is still a work in construction. You know, Austria, currently the chair of the EU, has announced its intention not to sign the Global Compact on migration. So to me, it's not a surprise that, say, countries like Kenya, Lebanon, you know, are saying, well, if the developed world is not doing much, why would we, you know, do that? And that's a huge problem, because 84% of the world's refugees is in these places. And that has dramatic consequences for, you know, our ability to protect people. You know, 5,000 Venezuelans, you know, escaping their countries a day. The Central Americans knocking on America's door. Syrians that are basically trying to get into Europe but stuck in, you know, detention camps in Greece. Now, as I said earlier, you know, much of this narrative, right, is really based on fear-mongering, misrepresenting the security risks and the economic cost of refugees and migrants. And the actual story of migration and integration is much more nuanced and successful all over the world. And that's something that we in IRC see every day. with the people that we work with. But anecdotal evidence, of course, is not evidence. And I mean, at Georgetown, a room full of scientists, right? I do feel that we have to, provide some evidence, The president's policies ignore the fact that, since 1980, 3 million people have more or less successfully, adapted to life in the United States. Economic evidence that says that labor force participation and, income of refugees rise over time. In the US, elsewhere. To give you one example, 2015, refugees contributed or raised revenue about $70 billion and contributed $20 billion of tax revenue to this country. So over time, I believe it was Bill Evans that did research with USCCB that sort of like demonstrated that over time, it's actually a net positive impact that refugees bring. And that is only looking at the economic contributions. I don't need to do the sort of like debunking of the security myths. I think the Cato Institute did that very effectively here in the United States. But just one single fact, since 1980, not a single refugee has committed, a lethal act of violence against, Americans on U.S. soil. And, for me, as a resettlement agency, and I talk often, to colleagues about that as well, it's a real mystery how we've lost this war on, facts and evidence. And I mean, I think it would make for a fascinating field of research, really, to look at that. But again, I am digressing. I'm supposed to talk about integration and early admission. Now, integration is not an easy term, as you well know. So, in the next few minutes, I'm going to go a little into the weeds, and I, ask you to forgive me. But at the same time, it's not my fault that, say, people cannot agree about, what integration is. There's broad agreement that integration is about moving from, from outsider to insider status. But, how you measure that, is actually a much more difficult question. And we as practitioners have actually tried to talk to academics for a long time. How do you do that? I wanted to introduce a recent tool from one of your, colleagues' institutions, Stanford's Immigration Policy Lab. They recently introduced a immigrant integration index. And I like the tool because it's a very simple tool, but also because Stanford's definition of integration comes very close to the one that we are applying at the IRC, which is basically the degree to which refugees and immigrants have the knowledge and capacity to build a successful and fulfilling life. So when we look at integration, we don't only look at economic integration, which is often the public narrative, but we look basically at 6 dimensions. Psychological integration. How connected do people feel, to their new country? Is there a sense of belonging over time? Economic integration, apart from income, and having a job, there is also the notion of job satisfaction as well. How happy are people in their jobs? Political integration, do people understand the political system, for starters, but then also are they actually able to, and will they, take political action? Social integration, there is the notion of identity, but then there is also the notion of bridging, identities, which is, I think, a really important aspect of integration as well. And then linguistic integration and navigational integration speak, for themselves. Now, when we talk about integration also, right, I think in dealing with many different populations, it's also very difficult to measure it because the populations that we work with are so diverse. And our own research around integration has also indicated that, say, where people are from, their gender, the duration of stay in the country, the age of arrival, legal status, are all factors that impact integration results. And we don't understand enough about the dynamics, and we should, because integration is such a contested, concept. So it is really important to consider these things. I wanted to, I'm almost out of the weeds. I wanted to, bring up two more points. And that is that we also really should not forget that, say, integration models are also defined by ourselves and by our cultural background. For example, the US model of integration is really a model that is fully based on early self-sufficiency, realizing, the economic dream. And so a lot of our integration programming is really focused on early employment, financial coaching, that kind of stuff. Now the linguistics amongst you, must have noticed by now that I am not American, that I'm Dutch, I'm European. And Europe's model of integration is a different one. There it is more about how do people have equitable access to what still is a welfare society. And so in Europe, refugees and immigrants have a much longer runway to the process of integration. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing, right, I will leave that completely in the middle. But what is important to remember is that these cultural differences also, have an impact on the type of programming and have an impact on, how we measure success. I wanted to sort of like come to like a form of a conclusion, because no matter your culture, no matter the differences, I think there are a couple of core elements that we as the IRC have witnessed that are really important and that need to be arranged for successful integration. I think the first thing that I would say is that, people should have a right to belong in a place. And the most permanent version of that is citizenship, of course. But before that, there are other forms of legal status that, if they are not arranged, right, it creates a vacuum that basically stops people from integrating well. And if I see in the US, the fact that refugees have basically a legal status when they come and have a clear path to citizenship, that is changing their outlook on, their own ability to succeed. And if you compare that with, say, asylum seekers, in Europe that, for months are in an asylum seeker center without being able to work, without being able to learn the language, without having a prospect of a legal status, that is really, an important component. And, how important that is actually, we can see not too far away. If you see how, a lot of the American nations that are actually supporting Venezuelan refugees are now quick to sort of like legalize Venezuelans' presence, in their country and sort of like provide some form of a legal status, that does make, the situation easier. The numbers are enormous and there is a lot of pressure on those countries as well, so I'm not saying it is perfect, but there are ways really to think about this, right of belonging and about conferring status as swiftly as possible, and also ensuring that during the process, skills and integration is not being lost. It's also important to sort of like, give people a right to defend them and then give them the tools to defend them. And so legal services are definitely a critical component in all of these programmings as well. And they need to be combined with social management or case management services. And, if you look at the lessons that the US is learning, on this, at the moment, they're not learning any lessons because they're doing the opposite of, what should be done. Second thing, the right to work. Whether we look at Uganda or Salt Lake City, Utah, the fact that people have the ability to work, make a living for themselves, is hugely important and cannot be underestimated. Also, because of the reasons that Rachel mentioned earlier, the fact that a refugee works is actually going to benefit the community that they're in as well. People buy stuff, they buy houses, they become economic contributors to the larger ecosystem. Now, of course, when integration policymakers make decisions, they do need to look at who is coming, what are their skills, and they also need to look at where are these people best placed. And I was very glad to hear Mike talk about the matching algorithms, right? I think nowadays, because of technology, we have a lot more ability to sort of like match supply and demand, and to make these decisions in a more considerate way than maybe they have been taken in the past. The third thing that I would say, and I believe everyone else on the panel said it as well, so it's just more of, reinforcing the point, that integration, successful integration, is mostly a local thing. You can't sort of like, ensure integration by having a national policy. It really is done in local communities with the support of local law enforcement, with the support of local leaders, with the support of local business people. And our next, I think, panel will speak, I think, much more eloquently about it. But we have learned at the IRC that, say, mayors, are as important interlocutors for us as that, say, the heads of an immigration department in countries are. So I'm really coming to the end, and I could talk for much longer about this. 50 minutes is not enough to, do justice to this topic. But I want to leave also with, a positive notion, and it goes back to the point that I started with, right? I think, there is a tendency of, highlighting the crisis and sort of like almost, have a defeatist approach to the problem. This problem of, migration, of refugee resettlement is a manageable problem. We can solve it. None of this, with political will, is unsolvable. Like I said, we are talking about, in the terms of refugees, we're talking about 0.3% of the world's population. Migration, right, that is now a big word and a big notion. There is this Professor Leo Lucassen from the Netherlands. He has basically, convincingly demonstrated that during history, it's about 3% of the world's population that's migrating. Today, that's no different. So we should solve this. We should have many more interactions like this, where I think practitioners and academia talk about how to best do that. But I believe definitely that there is a way out of this, refugee and migration challenge, and I look forward to further discussing how we're going to do that. Thank you.
Okay, we are now opening up the floor to Q&A. We have microphones, so just raise your hand. People will be coming from either side. There are a few questions on both sides here. And we'll take the Q&A seated since everyone is mic'd. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you all so much. Such a wonderful panel. I had a couple of comments and then a question. Hans, I'm sorry to disagree with you. You made the point, you said you think the United States is leading the race to the bottom on immigration policy. I'm ashamed to say I think Australia has already won that race. And right. I think if you want to see where some of these exclusionary tendencies in the US and Europe will end up, you only have to look at Australia.
I concede that point.
Yeah. I also wanted to just respond to what you finished with at the end and just say, I think I wonder if one of the reasons why we keep hearing this language of crisis is because we see migration gets constructed as an exception, as an aberration, where actually, historically, migration just happens. It's a normal part of life, and we need to shift this language from seeing it as a problem, as a crisis, to just something that's an everyday, nothing to see here kind of phenomenon. The question that I wanted to put to the panel was something I noticed in each of your presentations was this emphasis on the economic contribution of refugees, the development, the thriving of communities and things. And my question is, what happens to people who can't contribute? What kind of narrative do we have around them? How do we kind of make sure that their stories are told as well? And how does that kind of fit in and how do your organizations each approach that kind of issue?
Feel free. Not everyone has to answer every question, of course.
That
So
I'm happy to talk.
So actually, the way I would say it is that everyone is an economic contributor, and I mean HIAS is very intent on serving the disabled, people that can't work, but that adds cultural value to society. I have a 13-year-old, she volunteers with refugees. She learns and becomes more aware of the world in a way that she wouldn't otherwise. So I think that's a really good question, because sometimes I know that I get come across like this is a capital thing and it's about economics, but I think it's about the cultural impact as well, and that has an impact. So we, and HIAS especially, boasts about the fact that we try to take the most vulnerable. And actually I didn't say much about, I talked about HIAS in the US context, but HIAS is actually in 11 or 12 countries around the world, and we're actually hired by UNHCR to do screening, though people in these countries won't know that it's HIAS, but we're actually doing the screening and making referrals to UNHCR. But I think that's a really good question.
Hans?
So I think you pointed at a dilemma, right? Because, on the one hand, agencies like HIAS and the IRC, we want to, promote the image of the successful, resilient refugee that, survives, thrives, as an example that, that is, possible. But of course, not every refugee is a Sergey Brin or a Madeleine Albright. And not every refugee is a person with, severe war trauma that can't function anymore. So the way that we work with refugees that say, are very vulnerable or that are not making it is, there's a lot of work to be done in the United States in particular to make sure that people receive actually the services that they need. I pointed to the differences, between Europe and America as, one being a welfare state and, the other with a much stronger welfare system. A lot of our work in the United States is about, educating, health departments, providing the cultural competency that, say, these health departments need to then, for example, also deal with complex, mental health trauma as well. So yes, there are very vulnerable people that are, not always the economic success. They're being supported as well. The good thing is, and that is also something that we have to say as well, is I can go to any red state, in America, right? Any city, and I will find a warm, welcoming community, whether it's faith-based, whether it's volunteers, that are willing to step up also to support these people. So again, not sort of like to fight with my colleagues, right? But this fatigue, right, of, supporting refugees, I don't feel it in the United States. I would actually feel the opposite, and where there is almost like a paradox. We have this toxic narrative, at the center, but then we have this really sort of like, volunteers rising up at the local level. And in Europe, we see similar things. Pew did a poll recently that basically showed that, say, if you explain, what refugees have gone through or who they are, the support to actually receive them and integrate them, rises immediately. Sorry, that was a long answer.
I'd love to just quickly respond to that, if it's okay. First of all, we have a sister organization called Welcome to Australia in Australia, so. I have a pragmatic and a spiritual take on that question. On the pragmatic side, I think what we found in practice is that the real economic benefits come not because you're putting people into a workforce as workers or sort of immigrants as widgets coming into an economy, but because you're actually realizing people's innate human potential in a community, whether that's in a workforce, whether that's as a parent participating in their child's education. There's a million different ways to see that, and not all of them relate to somebody's economic ability. So, and that takes me to the spiritual side, which is, I mean, what we're really talking about here is how do we overcome our othering of one another to see one another as human beings? And that's a much deeper spiritual need that we have right now in our world. And I think until we tap into that reserve, you know, all of this becomes just a superficial policy conversation when it's really about that.
And I'll just add that, and kind of building on that, I think we have a long history of first-generation immigrants struggling in incredible ways, and yet the long-term benefit of having those families here and later generations and things. So I think there are many different ways to explain how in the long run and in the short run, given different gifts. I know there are places that we see all over the world where refugees and displaced people are not allowed to work under any circumstances, and they volunteer. And they contribute, and they want to contribute. So there are so many different ways to tell that story, but I think one of it also is generational, that we will see a long-term benefit of people coming here from different places.
Other questions right here? Use the mic, please, yes.
Hi, this question is addressed to Joan, and Hans brought up the international perspective. So I'm interested in this process of policy transfer between developing countries in terms of refugee issues. So how can Colombia, that is currently trying to define a refugee policy, learn from Lebanon or Jordan? Or what can we learn from Uganda, especially in conditions in which the developed world is not leading the way in trying to provide perhaps assistance in best policy and best practices? So from your organization, what has been the experience in terms of policy transfer and learning between developing countries?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go
no,
first.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Yeah. It's interesting that you're bringing this up, right? Because in particular, you know, a lot of people are making the comparison by what's happening in, you know, Venezuela right now with, you know, what happened in Zimbabwe and how, you know, countries, you know, supported each other and trying to understand it. I am not aware of any sort of like conversations that are happening between countries, but what I do know is that, you know, and this is a good thing that the State Department, in fact, that the State Department, you know, provided some financial support to agencies like the IRC to provide technical assistance to countries that, you know, want to set up a refugee policy, that want to set up a resettlement scheme. They did that for, you know, Europe and developing countries there. And a similar project now is underway for the Americas as well. So where there is, say, like, you know, a transfer of knowledge about, you know, what happened in other situations, and to see whether that can be of use there. I think your idea is actually a much more exciting idea, and it is something that we maybe should try to figure out, you know, how we can activate that. But there is definitely knowledge transfer happening at this point.
Yeah, I would just add that I think we have a responsibility to play a key role, organizations like ours, because we are in all those countries, and we're seeing what's happening on the front lines. And, you know, for JRS in particular, we have 3 key dimensions to our mission: accompaniment, service, and advocacy. So if we are not bringing knowledge and experience from different parts of the world to our advocacy in a given country when they're facing a situation like that, then we're really falling short of our mission. So, and I think there's a, you know, not insignificant amount of cooperation and partnership among a range of different, I mean, we work with IRC all the time, and we work with CRS, and we work with, so I think our role in that, we have to step up and really take responsibility for sharing some of that knowledge.
Yeah. Can I make one addition also to
One
what
short
I said?
comment?
Yeah, well, short. Now, that actually, you know, with the Cartagena Declaration, you know, I believe there's actually something that the rest of the world, you know, could learn from the Americas, because it's a much wider, I think, approach to conferring refugee status or protective status to people. So maybe we should invite the Colombians to come to Europe.
Yeah. Okay, one more question. Right here. All the way in the back, yeah.
Thanks again, all of you, for the work that you do and for your presentations. My question is actually kind of similar to the first one. I know that Canada has been really proactive in bringing like Yazidi women, especially like widows and their families. And I'm pretty sure, just actually kind of from hearsay, that they're being resettled in like kind of rural areas, maybe not super rural, but not in urban population centers. And I'm wondering, just logistically, as far as like immediate resettlement, how that can possibly work, and like what they're doing that might be different from what the United States is doing, both like immediate resettlement and maybe long-term. Yeah, given that they're widows, mostly uneducated, illiterate, facing those challenges. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm not really familiar with that specific practice in Canada, but I can speak to some like general comparisons. I think one of the main differences between Canada and the United States is indeed the level of, for example, healthcare and health insurance that is available in Canada and not in the US, which makes, I think, the resettlement of vulnerable cases, I think, a more feasible approach. Canada, as you know, also has a private sponsorship program where, groups of private sponsorships, of private members of society, are able to provide, in a very systemic, way, support financially, but also other types of support. Where that in the US, I mean, it's happening, but it's in a different developed state. So, in the US, the decision of where a family goes, right, is often a function of is there already other family members? Are they here? If that's the case, people usually want to be with their family, so they go there. And then there is also, a view on what are the needs of a certain family, and that also drive, decisions where these families are best resettled. So, a family with complex medical needs is not going to be resettled in a state where we know that, the public benefits are, bare bones. So there are ways to look at that. There are ways that is being considered. But the question about the Yazidi widows, I just don't have enough information to be able to answer that question.
I would just say that, Hans mentioned the private sponsorship model. Canada actually, and I don't know the exact percentage, but in Canada, families will actually, or communities will come together and actually they effectively sign a contract that they're going to look after and support a refugee family for 1 year. And it's a very, very structured process. So I don't know about the case that you're talking about, but I would imagine that it's possible that in some of these rural areas, maybe there are groups that have signed that agreement with the Canadian government to focus on widows specifically, though I can't say for sure. But the Canadians are really good at it, and so that's a good thing.
Although, go ahead, please.
Well, just to add that JRS Canada supports and facilitates the private resettlement program, and there is a great deal of kind of system set up about what they have to agree to do and what capacity and how much financially they have to have in place and all of that to make that work, and a lot of community support. What I hear from my colleagues there is, though, that they really want to lift up the government program as well, because they're afraid that the government is going to say, well, we've got this, voluntary, or church organizations and communities and things that are doing this, and we don't need to do so much. And in fact, it's the government programs that resettle the most vulnerable and the most at-risk people. The private system is really designed for people who have a high likelihood of thriving in the new environment, and the people who are at greater risk are supported by the government. I've not heard them say that there's a problem with Yazidis being resettled in rural areas. I'll certainly ask them about it and see what I can find out. But I know that they are very supportive of the government continuing their program because they do take more at-risk refugees.
And just to add a little bit of quick nuance to this, I think one of the interesting things that happens, at least with rural communities in the US, is people initially may get resettled somewhere, but then, we celebrate freedom in this country and there's the law of 2 feet. And so people will move to where their families are or where the jobs are. And in a lot of cases, that may be a rural community where you have a poultry processing plant opening, for example. And so then the question becomes, in that dynamic of a lot of natural migration happening not only to the US, but internally, how do we make sure that every place that a person might come to is one that is ready to incorporate them? And I think that's where the challenge is, but also where the opportunity is.
Okay, one more question here. You need a microphone, so hold on.
I live in Greenbelt, Maryland, and I belong to the Catholic community of Greenbelt, which is the breakaway from St. Hugh's. I mean, we're not mad at them or anything, we just broke away. We put together some money to do something with refugee families and to incorporate them right into where we live. The county overruled us, Prince George's County, that said we could not do it. And it really, how they got wind of it or how they knew, I don't know. But this was very serious and it was heartbreaking all the way around. And I just want to know if anybody can comment on that. Thank you.
I guess I would just say that it comes back to the idea that we have to be advocates at all times, and because if you have local governments that are establishing those kinds of restrictions, the only way to overcome it is to mobilize people to advocate on behalf of resettlement of refugees in your communities. So it's heartbreaking to hear that happened, but we've got to shift the policies at every level, I think, and that has to be a part of the ongoing way that we think about what it takes to respond to refugees and other displaced people.
I'm just really surprised about that, and I would be furious, and I would just ignore them. Because I mean, really Lutheran Social Services and the IRC are both resettling in Maryland. I don't know if IRC touches Prince George's County, but the Lutherans are actually resettling in Prince George's County. They have fantastic, they have this thing called the Circle of Welcome where they pull together faith, maybe that was, so I don't know what the case is in that scenario, but I know there's need, so kudos to you, and I'm sorry the government did that.
And I would just add to that, I mean, I don't know the particulars of that situation. You're going to hear from 2 great local government leaders in the next panel who maybe can be some role models to Prince George's County. But Prince George's County also has some peers in Maryland that are doing, moving in the opposite direction. Baltimore City is one example. So maybe there's some need for some local organizing, and I'm happy to talk more after this in terms of local government here in Maryland.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time. I would, the panelists will be here for a bit, so please seek them out. And just know the next panel will be dealing with some of the more local issues in different metropolitan areas around the country. So thank you so much to all of you and to all of you.